And so to tonight's event. I live in Glasgow, and as described by Boris Johnson, I was one of the bubble hat volunteers that helped welcome the world to, despite what he said, to Glasgow, which is where COP26 took place. The 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference brought people from across the globe together to accelerate action towards the goals of the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. As part of the cooperative party's focus on COP26, this online event will examine the key pledges that were made and what we need to do to ensure these are met. While long-term commitments send a very important signal, it's the key decisions on climate change made over these 2 critical weeks in Glasgow that will really have the biggest impact. So it is with great pleasure I hand you over now to our speaker, Shadow President for COP26 and Shadow Secretary for State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, Mr. Ed Miliband MP. Welcome, Ed.
Thanks so much, Ruth, and it's great to be with you. And can I just start by apologising that I have to go and vote. I'm voting against the government, you'll be pleased to hear, at 7 o'clock, which is why I have to leave just shortly before 7. So I'm sorry it's such a truncated session, but I did want to be with you. I'm a great supporter of the Co-op Party and the work that you do. Why don't I just reflect on COP for about 5 minutes, and then let's take as many questions as possible. I think the first thing to say is that we know what the aim of this COP was, which is to halve global emissions this decade by 2030. That was the mandate for the world. It was the mandate for the world set out in Paris. And the reason is that although the Paris Agreement of 2015 said that we should make efforts to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees, the truth is that the pledges from individual countries added up to about 2.7 degrees of global warming. Now, we know what going above 1.5 degrees means. We know that the climate emergency era is already here. It is around us. It's not some theoretical future. We know also it will be a hell of a lot worse the higher the temperatures go above 1.5 degrees. It means, for example, just the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. It can sound rather abstract. I think it's 1 billion more people facing extreme heat waves. It's 99% of our coral reefs destroyed. So every 0.1 of a degree matters. Now, on that metric, I would say Glasgow was modest progress, but way short of the transformation we needed. The best analysis is that the pledges made in Glasgow add up to something like 2.4 degrees of warming. So the 2030 pledges. So you'll have heard a lot of hullabaloo from Boris Johnson and from others about what a great success it was, how magnificent it was, how magnificent he was. I'm afraid, I wish I could say that it had been the scale of success that he's claiming, but I think it's just not correct. There was some important progress made on some issues around forests and coal, but with a lot of holes in it. It's good the world is moving on net zero emissions for the middle of the century, although a lot of those pledges are quite shaky in terms of their foundations. But the central reality is that the world is simply not moving fast enough. The world is moving faster than it was 10 years ago, but it's way short of where we need to be. So that's the sort of first kind of big picture thing I will say. Secondly, what about Boris Johnson? What did he do at this conference or before the conference? In my view, he did not do what was required. Most shamefully, he cut overseas aid. And by cutting overseas aid, he made it far harder to deliver another thing that was absolutely essential from Glasgow, which was the $100 billion of finance for poor and developing countries, for vulnerable countries. That was promised in Copenhagen at the Copenhagen Climate Change Summit, still not properly delivered potentially in 2023. And what you see with the government is it facing both ways on a whole range of issues. The Cambo oil field, the Cumbria coal mine, cutting air passenger duty for domestic flights, a trade deal with Australia where they relax the temperature requirements. Again and again, the government has looked the wrong way on climate, and that matters because it undermines your moral authority. That is what happened. That made it much harder for us to be the hosts. And just a sort of level of his lack of seriousness, the idea that Boris Johnson went on holiday 2 weeks before the COP, went for a day trip in the second week, says so much about him and the way he regarded this. He thought this was a great photo op for him. And I'm afraid he didn't really think about it with much more depth than that, in my view. What do we do now? We definitely don't give up hope because we need to keep pushing. The world has moved in the last decade. It's got to move a lot faster. And what are the elements of how we move faster? We can make a difference as the UK. We're the COP president for another year, but we can make a difference in any case. First of all, we've got to make it clear that the big emitters cannot be let off the hook. We're doing this trade deal with Australia. That trade deal should be rewritten to put 1.5 degrees at its heart. Why do I single out Australia? Because their 2030 target is compatible with not 1.5 degrees of warming, but 4 degrees of warming. So, we've got to use our muscle. We've got to use all of our efforts to push the big emitters to act. And people talk about China, and that's right, the US and others, but a country like Australia is really important in this. And it's sort of the basic idea is that to be part of the club of nations, you've got to do the right thing on climate. And climate can't be boxed off as a policy somewhere else. It's an absolutely central part of everything we do. If we take the emergency seriously, that's what we should be doing. Secondly, the whole issue of fossil fuels does need to be on the agenda. You'll know that the UK government looks like it's going to sanction the Cambo oil field, the equivalent of 18 new coal-fired power stations running for a year. You'll have seen that the language on coal was watered down. The UK is doing okay on coal, apart from the government flirting with the Cumbria coal mine. But secondly, fossil fuels need to be part of the story, and we need to be engaging with other countries on this question of how we manage this transition from fossil fuels. Thirdly, and in a sense most importantly, is we need to bring this home with the power of example. So at our conference, at the Labour conference, we made a really important commitment, which was to £28 billion extra of investment in each and every year up to 2030 in the climate transition. And that is about making this transition work and making it work in a fair way. It's about people being able to have their homes insulated, a national mission for retrofit and insulation, and be able to access zero carbon forms of energy like heat pumps. It's about how we have a decent public transport system, as well as helping people to buy electric cars, a decent public transport system that can actually give people proper alternatives. It's about the green spaces that people need. It's about our steel industry and how our steel industry makes the transition and how public investment can make the difference to that. And the reason I emphasize this point is a couple of reasons. Is that first of all, ambition and justice go together. We can be ambitious. We must be ambitious. We face this decisive decade, but we can only do it. We'll only take people with you if we have justice here in the UK and around the world. And both parts of that are incredibly important. And so making this transition fair is absolutely crucial in my view. And the second thing I would say to this audience is we talk a lot about avoiding climate disaster, and it's really important that we're truth-telling about what COP did and didn't achieve. But that's only one half of the story. We're not just in the disaster avoidance business. We are in the positive vision business about the kind of country we can create. And I think this is so important because when I passed the Climate Change Act in 2008, it did set an example that other countries then followed. We can set an example by being the first people to do the proper Green New Deal, by showing people that we can combine economic justice and climate justice together. And, we can end fuel poverty in our country. We can tackle all of those issues, the silent killer of air quality. We can create good jobs at decent wages for people. We can create that better public transport system. So there is a positive and exciting vision that we are going to lay out over the next year, 18 months, until whenever an election is, about the kind of country we can create. And by doing that at home, setting the right example, and working with countries around the world, we can tackle this. We can tackle this problem. We can rise to the scale of the emergency. We're not going to do this with the current government, but I believe strongly that with a Labour government, we must do this because and this is the point I'll end on, of all the issues we face, this is unique because the decisions we make in the next few years will have implications for the next few hundred, indeed few thousand years. And it is our responsibility to act and act at the scale the emergency demands.
Excellent, Fab. Thank you so much, Ed. Right, I'm going to jump straight into questions just so we can try and get through as many as possible as we have. So the first one is from Richard Simmons. Finance is the key to solving the climate emergency as it enables the necessary tech. What do you think of a carbon currency as a way of funding green development?
Well, I think that I'd like to know more about the idea that the questioner is asking about. I think finance is absolutely key in this. And, you know, let me just say something about finance, because what I think really matters is where is the money going from government? Is government making the investments that are necessary? But also, crucially, what is the private sector doing? And we, in the advance of COP, we said something which I think is quite important and the government hasn't acted on, which is we're 1% of global emissions, the UK, but our biggest businesses and financial institutions are something like 15% are responsible for 15% of global emissions. And we said that all of those major businesses and all of our large financial institutions should have to be compatible with 1.5 degrees in the investments they make. And so I think that is key to getting the kind of change that we need.
Just a reminder, because I can see people have raised their hands, we're not able, because we're limited with time, we're not able to unmute people. So if you have a question, can you put it in the chat just so we can get through as quick as possible? Thank you. The next one is from, and I apologise, I'm not very good at pronouncing words, Ryan Bayston. Is foreign aid going towards countries suffering from climate change effects, or countries developing so that they may develop in a more environmentally friendly way?
Really good question from Ryan. I think the answer is both. You know, the demand of the vulnerable and developing countries was that the 100 billion, which is still not properly delivered, that half of it should go to adaptation and half of it should go to what they call mitigation, which is cutting your emissions and developing in an environmentally friendly way. And so both are absolutely necessary. And I think it's Ryan who asked the question. I mean, look, it is a really important question because, you know, when you look historically, we're in the top 10, the UK, of emitters, and we do have a particular responsibility. But there's a third piece, which some of the people watching this may have heard about, which is this issue of loss and damage. And I'm afraid this has been not properly addressed. Loss and damage is the fact that it is vulnerable and poor countries who are not just having to adapt to climate change and not just having to grow in an environmentally friendly way, as Ryan says, but they are also facing massive costs as a result of this. I mean, never mind adapting, massive damage to their countries. And, you know, the shadow of injustice between developing and developed world hangs over these talks. I found that in Copenhagen in 2009. And so this issue of loss and damage is also a crucial thing. And we're going to have to come back to this at the COP next year. I should have said next year in Egypt, the COP27, where countries are supposed to come back and make additional pledges. And that's really important. But you know, we're going to have to return to these issues.
So next one from Tristram Burden. On energy transition in the UK, how can we bring the national grid into common ownership, scrap Ofgem and reintroduce an energy ministry? Sorry.
Look, there's lots of questions in there. We definitely do see a role for common ownership. And, you know, I think the questioner is completely right to highlight the fact that there are lots of different parts to our energy system. And anyone looking at the energy market at the moment would honestly see that it is a mess. You know, we've got this energy crisis going on. We've got bulb energy that has just fallen over. The government's having to take it over. I think it shows that this system is not working. And so what we're going to do, and we would love to work with the co-op party on this, is to work on, take a step back and say, okay, our energy system isn't working. It's not working for affordability. It's not working for energy security, and it's not working either for net zero. And the grid is definitely part of this. How do we reconfigure this system so it properly works to meet those objectives? And that's the work we're going to be doing between now and the election. And on the issue of where this sits in government, this is sort of above my pay grade, it's a decision for Keir Starmer. I mean, there's lots of conflicting views on this question about whether it's better off in bays, better off not in bays. I think that I'm always anxious about machinery of government changes because they tend to cause quite a lot of disruption. I wouldn't have made the change that the government originally made, getting rid of the department that I was the first Secretary of State of, Department of Energy and Climate Change. But that's something we do need to look at the systems and machinery of government we have. I think it's certainly not working well under this government. That may be partly because of this government and the fact that they're facing both ways. You know, their ministers are just not sufficiently committed to it. But I think it's a good point that does need to be looked at.
So next one is from Jean Roger Chilumba. Hope I got that right. Following the COP26 commitment on tackling deforestation, how progress will be monitored to preserve and protect the two lungs for keeping this planet's ecosystem, such as the Amazon rainforest and the Congo rainforest, as the two have the capacities for absorbing CO2 emissions?
A really good point. And, you know, just for those viewers who don't know about this, there was this agreement made on deforestation with lots of countries signing up. The problem with it is that a similar agreement, albeit with a smaller number of countries, was made in 2014 and deforestation got worse. And, you know, the question raises the issue essentially of enforceability. And that is a real, you know, just being frank with you, that is a problem right across the board in relation to these issues. You know, it's one thing for countries to make pledges, it's another thing for them to actually commit to them. And I think some of the countries who signed up on deforestation, or apparently signed up, I think Indonesia was one of them, then sort of said, well, we didn't, that's not exactly what we signed up to. So I think there are real issues about this. I mean, partly this is about finance, because if we can help to work with poorer countries to say, we're going to help finance the kind of end of deforestation, if you like, that will help. And there was some money as part of this. But I also this is kind of another important point to make, which is why I'm so fixated on the 2030 targets that countries make. The 2030 targets, the so-called nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, are not legally binding, but they are, at least you can be sort of accountable for them, because you've got to be transparent about what they are, they can be properly measured. I think my worry about the UK government strategy, which was to go and do these different side deals on deforestation and so on, is what's the real sort of accountability mechanism here in terms of how transparent these pledges are? Whereas these 2030 targets are, at least you kind of know whether countries are doing them or not. I think there's a truth though here, which is the world is going to have to think much, much harder about what are the ways, it goes back to my point earlier about the Club of Nations, what are the ways in which we use all of the levers at our disposal, not just the COP once a year, but what are the ways we use all of the levers at our disposal to really push countries to act? And it should be a sort of central condition of our relationship with countries that they act on climate, that opting out or just deciding, you know, are you interested or are you not interested in tackling this issue is no longer an option. And I'm afraid with this government, it feels like an optional extra at best for a lot of departments, and that's got to change.
Yeah. Right, okay, I know you have to rush off and we've had so many questions come in, so I'm afraid this will be our last one, and it's from Paul Harmon. What should we make as our priority, local, regional or national action?
Oh, I think it's a good question. I think the answer is all of them. And I think that's a really good kind of note to end on Paul's question. You know, local, absolutely essential. And, you know, I just want to thank all of the people on this call who are taking action in their own communities on these issues, because that can make a massive difference. And, you know, part of the challenge here is to engage people at a local level. I'm speaking at an event later on tonight around this issue of insulation and a national organizing campaign on insulation run by the New Economics Foundation, and you know, engaging people locally, whether it's in terms of nature, because I want to emphasize this is a nature and climate emergency. So engaging people in nature, engaging people in biodiversity, engaging people in some of these, how we can improve people's lives locally, all of the citizens' juries that have been done locally, all of the transition town movements, all of that, what the Labour local authorities are doing, it's incredibly important. Then nationally, we can set an example. We need to set an example. And every time the UK government faces both ways on climate, it makes other countries think, well, if they're facing both ways, are we really going to act? And so the power of example really matters here. And I genuinely believe this when I say we can be the first country. The US are talking about a Green New Deal, but it's hard to get it through Congress. A Labour government can be the first government in the world to properly do a Green New Deal. And our 28 billion investment each and every year up to 2030, additional investment, which is about 10 times more than the government, is going to make a massive difference to that. It prepares the ground for the Green New Deal that we need. And then finally, we're all in this together, developing and developed world, all countries together. Everyone needs to be in. If we don't have everyone in, then we're never going to solve this. 80% of emissions come from the 20 largest countries, the G20 countries. Everyone needs to be in this. And, it's now. It's not in the future. It's not maybe we'll do it next year. It's not we'll come back to you in 5 years' time. It's now. And, that's got to be the priority. So it's a great question to end on, Ruth. Local, national, global, we need all of them. And look, I really want to apologize that I didn't have more time for questions. I really appreciate all of the work that Co-op Party members are doing on these issues. I'm really interested maybe through your office, if people have examples about what they're doing locally, they want to send in to us, I'd be really interested to hear about them. This is the fight. This is the fight that matters. This is the reason I'm back on the front bench, because I care so much about this issue and I care about us tackling it. So thank you to you and the Co-op Party for all the work you do, and thank you for hosting me this evening.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ed. And I know you have to run off.
Thanks so much, and sorry to go.
That's okay, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and a special shout out to Susie from the RNID for providing closed captioning for this event. And yeah, sorry, it was a very short and sweet but very insightful event this evening, and apologies we couldn't get through all the questions. So yeah, thank you for joining us today, and I hope we've addressed some of the areas you were concerned about, had questions about. Do remember the Co-op Party is continuing to hold these weekly Zoom events. So if you're interested in finding out more on the ongoing work of our politicians across the UK, do check the party's cooperation live page on the website www.party.coop. And finally, the team, as always, at Co-op Party HQ are here to support our members. So do reach out if you'd like more information or advice at any time. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening and keep safe.